Sitting at the dining table, sipping my coffee when Kathy sat down across from me, with an unusual expression on her face. I could tell something was coming, but I had no idea what it would be. Taking a deep breath, she said, "I have been having an affair with my boss, Alex." The words were blunt, without the hesitations or stammering he might have expected from someone making such a confession. She didn't seem apologetic or even guilty. Instead, she explained it as though it were a choice he simply needed to accept. "I will make sure that you get your share of physical intimacy," she promised, as if it were some kind of consolation prize. "I'll make sure you're not left out, Ben, but you need to understand." I felt a mix of disbelief and insult building in my chest. There was an absurdity to it that nearly made me laugh, but I held it back and looked her in the eyes. This woman I had been married to for 3 years was sitting across from me, calmly suggesting that we continue our marriage while she maintained an open affair. I wondered if I had ever truly known her. After a moment of silence, I couldn't hold back anymore. A short, dry laugh escaped my lips and I shook my head. "Kathy, if you think I'm gonna sit here and go along with this, you don't know me yet. You don't get to just throw your decisions at my face and expect that I'll accept your affair. I am not your doormat. You need to find yourself a divorce lawyer." She stared back at me, surprised by my response. Maybe she thought I would be passive, or maybe she thought I needed her enough to tolerate anything. But her expression changed as she realized I was serious. She hadn't expected me to be that blunt. As I pushed my chair back, ready to leave, Kathy's expression darkened. There was something menacing in her eyes, a sharpness I'd never seen before. She leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Ben, sit down. You don't get to just walk out on this conversation." I stopped and looked at her. She met my gaze, her lips curving into a cold, almost smug smile. "You think you can just leave, find a lawyer, and be done with me?" She said. "No, Ben, that's not how this is going to work." I stared at her. "Really? You think your threats will work?" "It will," she said, leaning and even closer. "If you try to walk away from me like this, I will ruin you. Do you understand? I'll go to the police. I'll tell them you hit me, that you threatened me." Her words were calm, almost casual. "They'll believe me. Ben, who do you think they'll trust? A well-respected attorney? Or some accountant nobody's ever heard of?" She tilted her head, watching me. "You think you'll just pick up and move on? But I'll make sure you have nothing left. I'll make sure you're begging to come back." I couldn't believe this was the same person I'd married. It was like I was staring at a stranger, someone who didn't care about destroying everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built. She looked at me as though she already knew I'd given, as though she was certain I wouldn't dare to risk the nightmare she was threatening. "So here's how this is going to go," she continued. "You'll stay, you'll play along, and you'll keep your mouth shut, where I will take everything from you and burn it to the ground. Your choice, Ben." I was still reeling from Kathy's threat when she leaned back in her chair, almost as if she'd made up her mind about something. She crossed her arms, a smug look on her face. "Oh, and one more thing, Ben," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I think it's time you meet Alex. He's coming over tomorrow." I blanked, barely processing her words. "What, are you really that dumb? You heard me." She smiled, a twisted, mocking expression. "He wants to meet you, and I want you to be on your best behavior. Be a nice boy for me, Ben." The humiliation cut deep, but I stayed silent, waiting for her to finish. "I expect you to make him comfortable, offer him a drink, maybe even a snack," she continued, as if she were dictating some normal household errand. "Who knows? Maybe he'll even be nice to you." I clenched my fists under the table, the anger bubbling up, but I forced myself to hold my tongue. She was looking at me, daring me to push back, to say something, anything that would give her more power over me. "Do you think it is a good idea, Kathy? What makes you think you can pull this off?" I said with a calm voice. Kathy leaned in, her smile fading, replaced by a hardness I hadn't seen before. "Because I can, Ben. Because this is my life, and I'll do what I want. And if you want to keep a shred of dignity, you'll do exactly as I say. I'll see you and Alex here tomorrow. And you'd better make a good impression. Kathy, have you heard of Newton's laws of physics? For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. However, with me the action might be something that you may not like. Rest, it's your call. This is the last suggestion that I will give you. Talk to your lawyer. Don't make it messy. This marriage is over. Walk away while I still allow you to walk. Your threats will never work on me because I have an alpha male in my life. You are nothing. With that, she got up and left the room, leaving me there alone. It was clear. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a battlefield, and now I needed to hit back. The next evening, I was sitting alone in the living room, nursing a glass of Jack Daniels, trying to steel myself for the absurdity that was about to unfold. I heard the front door open, Kathy's voice full of forced cheer as she greeted him. I took a long sip, watching as she led him into the room, her hand resting on his shoulder like he was some prized trophy. Then I got my first look at him. Alex was shorter than I'd imagined. Fat. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my chest, and before I could stop myself, it slipped out. The whole thing was so ridiculous I could hardly believe it. This was the so-called alpha that Kathy had thrown everything away for. I looked him up and down, shaking my head, the laugh turning into a scoff. He was just 5 feet tall and shorter than Kathy. This leprechaun, I said, pointing at him, barely able to keep the smirk off my face. This is the guy you call an alpha male, Kathy. He does not even need to dress for Halloween. He can just wear a green suit, and he will be a leprechaun. Kathy's smile wavered, a flash of irritation crossing her face, but she tried to hide it. Watch your mouth, Bin, she snapped, her voice low and cold. Alex is everything you're not. Confident, assertive, a real alpha man. Oh really? I said, leaning back and taking another sip of my drink, feeling a rush of defiance. If this is what you think an alpha looks like, Kathy, maybe I was giving you way too much credit. Alex looked at me, glancing at Kathy as if he was looking for some kind of cue. I could see he didn't expect me laughing at him. It was hard not to find the whole scene a little comedic. Tell me, Alex, I said, unable to resist. How does it feel to come here into my home and play house with my wife? His face reddened, his attempt at bravado crumbling, and he shot another uncertain look. Kathy. Enough, Bin, Kathy hissed, her eyes blazing. I told you to be respectful, I said, letting out a humorless chuckle. I'm supposed to be respectful. You bring this hobbit in here, throw him in my face, and expect me to roll over and play nice. I could see her seething, but it didn't matter. Alex's face turned red as he tried to regain his composure, but his voice was dripping with anger. Listen, Bin, he said, his tone sharp and cocky. You think you're going to just walk away from this? I don't think so. Kathy and I have talked it over, and we'll make sure you end up with nothing. In the divorce, I'll make sure she takes everything. Straight down to the shirt on your back. He took a step closer, a smug smile forming on his face. And by the way, after we're done here tonight, I'll be sleeping with her in your bed. I held my ground, meeting his gaze without a hint of intimidation. Really, Alex, you think you can just waltz in here, throw around a few threats, and walk away with my life? Trust me, he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. We'll take the house, the car, your job's income, everything, and we'll make sure you regret ever standing up to her. I raised an eyebrow. The house? I asked, barely able to contain my laughter. That house isn't even mine, Alex. It belonged to my mother. I just live here. You won't get a penny from it. Alex's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, shifting to his next weapon. Fine, but we'll still take your job's income. Kathy deserves it, and I'll make sure you're paying her for the rest of your life. I couldn't help but smirk, taking another slow sip of my drink. Sorry to disappoint you, Alex, but I already resigned from my job. What? Alex's smug expression finally cracked, his eyes darting to Kathy as if she'd somehow betrayed him. He looked completely blindsided. That's right, I continued, feeling a surge of satisfaction. So no assets, no job, no income for you to leech off. I guess that little plan of yours isn't quite as airtight as you thought. Kathy glared at me, clearly caught off guard and furious, while Alex stood there, struggling to process the situation. I could see the gears turning in his head, realizing that the payday he'd counted on was slipping away. I looked between the two of them, finally feeling in control of my own life again. "So, Alex," I said, my tone calm but pointed, "why don't you rethink exactly what it is you think you're taking from me? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you're the one who's got nothing." Alex's face twisted with a smug grin as he leaned in closer, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're not in charge here, Ben," he said, practically taunting me. "I'm the alpha now, and you'll do what you're told. In fact, I think I'll take Kathy upstairs to your bed. Right now, there's nothing you can do about it." I set my glass down slowly, my blood boiling as I looked him dead in the eyes. "Alex," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm warning you, get out of my house. Right now." But instead of backing down, he laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. And before I could react, he slapped me across the face. Hard, the slap stung. But the fury it ignited inside me was something else entirely. He straightened up, looking at me with a smirk, clearly enjoying himself. "You really think you can stand up to me?" he sneered. "Guys like you are just all air and no substance. I'm the real deal and I can destroy you, Ben. You're nothing. You're not like me or in control, and I'll make sure you rot in jail if you try anything. You'll be begging for mercy by the time I'm done with you." The slap stung, but it gave me a smile. Ben felt the slap sting his cheek, and something in him snapped. All the humiliation, the rage, the months of disrespect, they boiled over, breaking through the restraint he tried to hold on to. He stood up from his chair, his fists clenched, his voice low and steady. "You think you're the real deal, Alex?" Ben's fist connected with Alex's jaw, and he went stumbling back, barely able to react, before Ben hit him again, then again. With every punch, Ben let out the words he'd been holding back. "You think you're the real deal, Alex?" he said, a dark determination settling over him. "Real men don't try to tear apart other people's lives. Real men don't walk into another man's home and act like they own it. And they don't ruin marriages for their own ego. You're nothing, Alex. Real men protect their families." Another punch landed squarely on Alex's ribs, and Ben heard a satisfying crack. "Real men have integrity." Alex was gasping now, trying to put his hands up in defense, but Ben didn't stop. Each punch was a release. Each hit an exorcism of the anger that had been building for so long. Finally, Ben picked Alex up in his hands, looked him in the eyes and said, "I am no alpha or a beta. I am the man." With that, he hoisted Ben over his head and slammed him down on the floor. Alex was crumpled on the floor, bruised and beaten. Ben took a step back, breathing hard, his chest heaving as he looked down at the man who had thought he could come into his life and tear it apart. Kathy stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched Alex crumble to the ground, bloodied and bruised. Her hands trembled, rage and fear mixing inside her. Without thinking, she rushed at Ben, her fists flying, pounding uselessly against his back in a desperate attempt to make him stop. But before she could land another punch, a woman's firm grip seized her wrists, yanking her backward. Kathy let out a startled scream as she was pulled off balance, spinning around to face her attacker. The woman holding her was tall, with short cropped hair and an intense, unwavering gaze. Her grip was unrelenting, like iron around Kathy's wrists. She tried to struggle, but the woman was too strong. Her movements calculated, swift and controlled. "Let me go," Kathy screamed, jerking her arms, but the woman's hold tightened. "No," the woman, Linda, said, her voice low and commanding, "You're done." With an almost terrifying ease, Linda twisted Kathy's arms behind her, forcing her to her knees. Kathy gasped, unable to fight back as Linda used her body's weight to slam Kathy down onto the floor beside Alex. Linda wasn't done yet, though. She stepped back, assessing Kathy for a moment, and then, with savage precision, she began delivering a series of brutal blows. Her fists came down with unyielding force, landing against Kathy's chest and stomach. Her strikes a mixture of speed and power that only someone trained in hand-to-hand combat could deliver. Each punch knocked the wind out of Kathy, and she could barely gasp for breath between the hits. Kathy tried to shield herself, but it was useless. Linda moved like a storm, relentless and unstoppable. The former Marine was no stranger to fighting, and she showed it as she hammered into Kathy. Ben, still catching his breath, stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. He turned to Linda, her stance strong, calm and confident, as if she had just neutralized the threat with ease. "I don't think she's going to be causing you any more problems," Linda said with a grim satisfaction, watching as Kathy lay there, gasping for breath. She's learned the hard way what happens when you mess with the wrong people. Ben thanked Linda for staying hidden during the confrontation and helping him out with Kathy, as he could never raise his hand on a woman. The police and medics arrived shortly after Linda had finished with Kathy and Alex, their sirens wailing in the distance as they rushed into the house. Ben stood in the corner, trying to steady himself, watching as they took control of the scene. Alex was barely conscious, his face swollen and bloodied, while Kathy was sitting up, her eyes wide with a mix of rage and fear. Both of them were swiftly loaded into ambulances and carted off to the hospital, where the real fallout would begin. Once they arrived, the officers continued their questioning. Alex, still groggy from the beating, attempted to assert himself, despite the pain. He was sitting up on a hospital bed, his voice shaking but filled with defiance. "I want to file a complaint against Ben," Alex demanded, trying to muster what little bravado he had left. "He attacked me in cold blood, and I want charges pressed." The officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense look, flipped his notebook closed with a slow, deliberate motion, his gaze never leaving Alex. "You sure about that?" the cop asked, his voice low, his tone suddenly colder than it had been. "You realize who you're talking about, right?" Alex, trying to regain some control of the situation, looked confused. "What are you talking about?" The officer leaned in, lowering his voice as he spoke. "Ben's a former biker, associated with a pretty notorious biker gang, the kind of people you don't want to mess with. If you file that complaint, you won't just be dealing with him. You'll be dealing with all of them." Alex's bravado began to crack, his eyes widened, and his throat tightened as the realization hit him. The cop didn't stop there. "This beating," the officer continued, a hard edge to his words, "it'd be a cakewalk compared to what might come your way if you make this a police matter. Are you man enough to take on all of them? Because I can guarantee you, if you push this, it's not just going to be Ben knocking on your door." Alex gulped, his hands shaking now. He glanced over at the officer, then backed down at his own bruised and battered body. The image of Ben's fists, the way they had hammered him into submission, was still fresh in his mind. But now, the idea of dealing with an entire gang of bikers, people who probably had no problem taking things further than just a few punches, left him terrified. Alex's face paled. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape, but there was none. He couldn't stop thinking about what the officer had just said. Ben and his gang weren't people to be taken lightly. "No," Alex muttered, his voice trembling. "No, I won't file anything. Forget I said anything." His bravado had evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The officer nodded, closing his notebook with a snap and standing up. "Good choice. I'd advise you to keep your distance from Ben and from anyone connected to him. You wouldn't want to end up regretting this further." Alex didn't respond. His mind was already racing, the fear of what might come next flooding his thoughts. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was certain: this was far from over, and he wasn't ready to face the consequences of angering someone like Ben, or worse, his associates. Kathy stood outside the hospital room, her face bruised but mostly intact, a deep anger still simmering inside her. She was determined to confront Alex and make sure they both stuck to the plan. She had been humiliated and beaten, but she wasn't going to let Ben get away with it. She would file for divorce, destroy him, and leave him with nothing. That was the plan, at least. She walked into Alex's room, her steps purposeful. He was sitting on the bed, his face a mess of cuts and swelling, and his eyes were sharp. When he saw Kathy, he looked up at her, clearly still shaken from the beating he had taken. Earlier, Kathy was ready to lash out, to demand that they stay strong and finish what they had started. But as soon as she stepped inside, Alex's reaction was not what she expected. "Leave me alone, Kathy," Alex said, his voice hoarse. "I don't want anything to do with this anymore. I value my life. You've really gotten us into something we should have never been part of. This is bigger than I thought." He stared at him, stunned. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, stepping closer. "We can still make this work. I'll divorce him, take everything." "No," Alex cut her off, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. If you value your life, you need to drop everything, leave Ben, and get out of town." Now, Kathy blinked in confusion. "What are you saying? What do you mean? Leave him?" Alex swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably on the bed. He hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking again, his voice trembling. "Ben isn't just some guy you can divorce and walk away from. He's connected. He was part of a biker gang, a really dangerous one. I don't know all the details, but I know enough. People like him don't just let things go. If you go after him, if you try to take anything from him, he'll come after you, Kathy. And trust me, it won't be a slap across the face. It'll be worse." Kathy's heart started to race. She'd known Ben had a rough past, but she had always assumed it was just that, a past. She had no idea just how dangerous his past really was. Alex was shaking now, the fear in his eyes palpable. "Ben's not just a regular guy, Kathy. I was stupid to think we could take him on. If you file for divorce and try to take anything from him, you'll be marked. You're dealing with a whole other level of danger. And it's not just Ben. You're gonna piss off the whole gang. You won't get away. They'll find you. They'll make your life hell. You need to leave. And you need to leave now. No divorce. No nothing. Just go." Kathy stood frozen, her thoughts racing. Alex's words felt like a slap in the face, but the fear in his eyes was real. This wasn't some idle threat. Ben's past was something far more dangerous than she had ever realized. She had always seemed Ben as weak, someone she could control, but now it was clear that she had underestimated him and his past. The man who had once seemed like the perfect victim was something far darker, something she had never anticipated. "I didn't know," Kathy muttered almost to herself. Her mind was spinning. She had made so many plans for revenge, for taking everything from Ben. But now she wasn't sure she could follow through. What Alex was saying made too much sense. "Alex," Kathy said, her voice trembling. "What do I do now?" Alex's voice dropped to a whisper. "You do nothing. You walk away quietly. If you try to drag this out, if you try to take him down, you're not just fighting him. You're fighting everything he's connected to. And you'll lose. You need to leave him and leave now. Before it's too late." Kathy looked at him, her hands shaking. She was trapped in a nightmare she had created. The fear settled in deep, a cold, terrifying truth creeping over her. She wasn't the one in control anymore. And it was clear now. If she didn't listen to Alex, if she didn't just walk away and disappear, Ben's world was going to consume her whole. The atmosphere in town shifted in the days following Kathy's hasty decision. The sound of roaring engines filled the streets, 70 bikers, each on their massive machines, patrolling with a steady, intimidating presence. Their thunderous engines reverberated through every corner of the town, a constant reminder of the power that lay behind Ben's past. It was as if the very air had thickened with tension. Kathy, her resolve broken and her mind clouded with fear, wasted no time. She met with Alex's lawyer, signed the divorce papers, and walked away with nothing. No assets, no custody. The settlement was a stark reminder of just how little control she had left over her own life. Alex had assured her it was for the best. But deep down, Kathy knew she was leaving town. Not just to escape Ben, but to save whatever was left of her life. 5 days after signing the papers, Kathy was gone. She packed her things quickly, taking only what she could carry, and left without a word to anyone in town. She disappeared as swiftly as she had come. Her name now just another whisper in the wind, but Alex was not as fortunate. Despite his earlier bravado, his encounter with Ben's world had only just begun. For the 7 days he spent in the hospital, recovering from his injuries, a constant presence lingered by his bedside. Every day, without fail, 2 bikers arrived during visiting hours. They never spoke to him. They never touched him. They didn't need to. They simply sat quietly. Their gaze is fixed on him, unwavering and cold. Every time he woke up, groggy and in pain, those 2 men were there silently watching. It wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Each visit was like a reminder that Alex had crossed a line, and now he was at the mercy of forces far beyond his understanding. They didn't need to speak. Their presence alone was enough to keep him in a constant state of fear. The days dragged on, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was being sized up, judged, not just for what he had done, but for what he might do next. And every time he looked up at them, he realized there was nothing he could do. His fate had already been sealed, and it was no longer in his hands after 7 days. When Alex was finally discharged from the hospital, knowing that he had narrowly escaped to fate far worse than anything he had ever imagined. He'd learned the hard way that not all battles were meant to be fought, and not all men could be intimidated. Some men had entire worlds behind them, worlds that didn't need to raise a finger to bring you to your knees. His trip from hospital to home was again a nightmare. 70 bikes escorted him. Alex's life after his release from the hospital was a slow unraveling. At first, he tried to go about his normal routine, but everywhere he went, he couldn't escape the ever-present eyes of the bikers. They were always there, lurking in the background, at the gas station, on street corners, in the shadows of alleyways. No matter how fast or far he tried to run, they were always one step behind, watching, waiting. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just paranoia, a product of the brutal beatdown he had endured. But as the days passed, the reality set in. They weren't just following him, they were making sure he couldn't escape. Wherever he went, wherever he tried to hide, there they were 2 or 3 of them, always just within his sight, silent, unmoving, watching him like predators waiting for the moment to strike. Alex tried to summon the courage to do something about it. He thought about going to the police. He had an entire story to tell about Kathy, about Ben, about the threats, the gang, the constant surveillance. But every time he tried to take action, something stopped him. He was the sight of the bikers that paralyzed him with fear, that deep, gnawing anxiety in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that even if he went to the cops, it would do no good. They were everywhere. Then, one day, just as Alex was heading to the local police station, something stopped him cold. He was walking down the sidewalk when he spotted a familiar figure across the street. None other than the town's police chief. But what caught Alex off guard wasn't just seeing him. It was the leather biker jacket the chief was wearing. The very same one that the bikers wore, the one with the unmistakable patch. Alex's heart dropped into his stomach. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a local gang. This was their town. The bikers weren't just some rogue group of criminals. They were embedded in the very fabric of the community, with their reach extending into every corner, including the police force itself. He froze, staring at the police chief, whose face betrayed no emotion as he walked past. The chief didn't even glance at Alex, but the message was clear. There was no escaping this. The town was under the control of people who answered to a much darker force than Alex had ever realized. Alex's thoughts began to spiral. He could no longer ignore it. The bikers weren't just following him. They were controlling him, making sure he understood that there was no safe place, no way out. His every move was being watched, not just by the bikers, but by the very institution he had once believed would protect him. With no other options left, Alex knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay. He couldn't fight, not against Ben's world, not against the bikers who seemed to have infiltrated every part of town. He had no choice but to leave. That night, Alex packed what little he had left. He didn't tell anyone. There was no point. The bikers had won. They had broken him, cornered him, and now they had made sure he had nowhere to run. No one to turn to. The last thing he could do was disappear, to vanish from this place that had been his home before they made the decision for him. The next morning, he was gone, leaving behind everything he had once known. As he drove away from the town that had suffocated him, Alex couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. He was no longer hounded, no longer watched, but at the same time, he knew that wherever he went, wherever he tried to hide, the shadows would always be there, waiting. The bikers had marked him, and Ben's world, with its endless